wedding. Right as I reached the entrance of the venue, over 20 people from my fiancé's family blocked my path. My son has already married someone else. Get out. Unexpectedly, at that exact moment, a Rolls-Royce pulled up right behind me. One of the most well-known tech billionaires in the country stepped out of the car. Thank you for saving my son's life. The next day, when my fiancé's family tried to see me again, they were absolutely petrified. Just hours before that chaotic scene, I had pulled off my scrub cap, the sweat still beading on my forehead and sliding in a thin line down my temple. My hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline, not from fear, but because I had just made it through an incredibly dangerous operation, pulling a patient back from the brink of death. In my mind, the steady beep of the OR's heart monitor still echoed, a monotonous and cold sound, much like the way death knocks on the door. Lily, the scrub nurse, handed me my phone and whispered, her voice a mix of concern and hesitation. Doctor, Sarah, an unknown number keeps calling nonstop. It's gotta be the groom's family. I looked at the flashing screen and felt a heavy weight in my chest. Today was the day of my wedding to Greg. I had requested the day off months in advance. I had promised my mother, Irene, that I would arrive early, that I would be a flawless bride, so she could feel proud in front of his entire family. But in the early hours of the morning, the ER had sent up a severe trauma case in hypovolemic shock. The family had been weeping inconsolably in the hallway, screaming for a doctor as if their own lives depended on it. Dr. Miller, the chief of surgery, looked at me and said only one thing, Sarah, can you scrub in? I knew in that moment I couldn't turn my back on them. 4 hours in the operating room, completely unaware if the sun had even risen outside, only conscious of the fact that a very small boy lay on the operating table, his face so pale it was almost translucent. If I had delayed even a little, just 1 minute, there would have been nothing left to save. I gave it my all until the back of my scrubs was soaked in sweat, and my neck ached as if it had been stretched to its absolute limit. When I finally heard the anesthesiologist say, "He's stable, doctor," I was able to let out a breath like someone breaking the surface of the water. But stepping out of the OR meant plunging into different waters, those of real life. I hurriedly threw on the simple wedding dress I had hanging in the locker room, fastening each button with clumsy fingers. I had no time for makeup. I just pinned my hair up, wiped the sweat from my face, and sprinted to the parking garage. As I drove, I tried to calm myself by thinking that I would explain everything. No matter how strict my future mother-in-law seemed, she would have to understand. Greg was a reasonable guy. He loved me. He would take my side. When I pulled up to the country club where the reception was being held, I had barely opened my car door when a group of people surrounded me as if I were a criminal. At the forefront was Greg's mother, the woman I was supposed to start calling my mother-in-law today. Her name was Agnes. Her arms were crossed, her face tense, and her lips pressed into a harsh, thin line. Behind her stood a wall of relatives from the groom's side, so many that it made me dizzy. I glanced around and shuddered. There were at least 20 people. They all looked at me like I was a saboteur. Agnes pointed a finger right at my face, her voice as sour as vinegar. "You still have the nerve to show up here, Sarah?" I froze, trying to keep my composure. "Agnes, I am so sorry. Early this morning, I had a surgical emergency and I couldn't abandon the patient." "Don't you dare call me Agnes with that kind of familiarity." She spat, emphasizing every syllable. "I will not accept this disrespect. On the most important day for this family, you just decide not to show up, making us the laughingstock in front of all our guests. What do you think this family is?" I swallowed hard, feeling all their stares piercing me like hundreds of needles. My face burned, but I still tried to speak gently. "It wasn't my intention. I'm a doctor." Someone was in critical condition. A man in his 40s, Greg's older brother, Ian, stepped forward, his voice icy. "So what if you're a doctor? A doctor should also know that her wedding day is her wedding day. Leaving the groom stranded at the altar is a disgrace." I looked past them toward the grand ballroom and faintly heard wedding music, toasts, and cheers. Confused, I asked, "Where is Greg? Let me see Greg. I'll explain it to him." Agnes let out a mocking laugh, a sound that cut right to the bone. "What do you want to see him for? It's too late. My son has already married someone else." I thought I had misheard. "What did you say?" Agnes lifted her chin, speaking loudly so I would understand perfectly and leave quickly. My son went ahead with a ceremony with Claire, a girl who actually understands what respect and affection mean. Not like you, who only lives for the hospital without caring at all about family. I stood paralyzed. I knew Claire. She was Greg's so-called childhood friend. Ever since I had been introduced to the family, Agnes hadn't stopped praising her how well she cooked, how she took care of her parents, how submissive and traditional she was. I always thought it was just the habit of older folks to compare and talk for the sake of talking. I never imagined they would dare turn those words into a dagger plunged into my own wedding day. I heard my own voice ask, as if it belonged to someone else. What ceremony? I haven't signed anything. I didn't consent. Oh. You're still talking? Ian interrupted with disgust. Have a little dignity. You're not worthy. Leave. Another woman, probably Greg's Aunt Stella, chimed in. What a stubborn girl, putting work before her husband. Go home, don't make a scene. The family already has a new daughter-in-law. I looked at them, one by one. Whenever I worked overtime, whenever I had night shifts, I always believed that if I lived decently and fulfilled my duties, they would eventually understand me. And now, on the most important day of my life, they had formed a human wall, blocking my entrance, tossing me aside like defective goods. I clenched my fists tightly, my nails digging into my palms until it hurt. I didn't cry. I refused to let them see me weak. I just said, clearly and word by word, let me see Greg. I need to hear it from his mouth. Agnes sneered. Greg is busy toasting with the guests. He doesn't have time for you. Get lost. Get out of here. A few men behind her took a half step forward, as if preparing to physically drag me away. Right at that exact second, the deep, powerful rumble of a luxury car engine echoed behind me. The sound was unmistakable. It glided to a halt right behind the group, causing everyone to instinctively turn around. I turned, too. It was a sleek, gleaming black Rolls-Royce, so elegant that even the afternoon sun seemed to reflect off it softly. The back door opened, and a middle-aged man stepped out. He was tall, with broad shoulders, dressed in a sharp dark suit. He was followed by an assistant and 2 bodyguards. He looked around, his eyes landed on me, and he walked briskly toward where I stood. His face wasn't that of an arrogant billionaire, but rather of someone exhausted and profoundly grateful, like a man who had just survived a night between life and death. He stopped right in front of me and bowed deeply. The entire group of the groom's family seemed to freeze. Agnes's jaw dropped. The man spoke with a deep, clear voice that resonated across the country club entrance. Dr. Sarah, isn't it? I'm Arthur. I've come to thank you. Thank you for saving my son's life. I was stunned. Suddenly, I remembered that in the early hours of the morning, among the relatives waiting outside the OR, there was a man pacing back and forth. His face as tight as a violin string, his eyes red-rimmed, though he was trying hard to hold it together. At the time, I had barely glanced at him, not caring who he was, because the little boy's life was the only thing that mattered. Before I could say anything, Arthur took my hand and squeezed it firmly. His hand was cold, but his grip was very real. He continued, his voice breaking slightly. Without you, my son, I don't think I would have anything left to live for. Tonight, my family is entirely in your debt. I gently pulled my hand back, not out of discomfort, but because everything was happening too fast. I could barely respond. I only did my duty. Rest assured, the boy is going to be fine. Arthur turned to look at the group blocking the entrance, and his gaze suddenly changed, becoming cold and razor-sharp. And who exactly were you telling to get lost just a moment ago? The atmosphere plummeted. The mouths that had been so aggressive just a minute ago snapped shut. Agnes became tongue-tied for a second before forcing a sickly sweet smile. Oh. Excuse me. It's just a misunderstanding. She's my daughter-in-law. We were just discussing some family matters. I listened to her words with sheer bitterness. Just a moment ago, she was screaming that she didn't accept me as a daughter-in-law. Now, seeing a powerful, wealthy man standing beside me, she changed her tune instantly. Arthur didn't even bother looking at her. He turned back to me, his voice softening. Dr. Sarah, would you mind accompanying me for a moment? This place is far too noisy. I'd like to thank you properly. I looked toward the grand doors of the venue, the place I was supposed to enter amidst music and congratulations, but which was now just a human wall of betrayal. Suddenly, I felt completely drained, as if all my energy had been siphoned out. I nodded. All right. Just that simple gesture made the entire group of the groom's family change their expressions. I heard someone sharply suck in a breath. I saw their anxious, darting eyes. I walked alongside Arthur toward the gleaming black car. As I turned my back to them, I heard Agnes calling out to me in a rushed, panicked voice. Sarah, sweetheart! About earlier, I didn't answer. I just walked with slow but firm steps, because I had finally understood something. There are doors that, when slammed in your face by others, you do not need to stand outside and beg to be opened. You just have to turn around and pave a new path for your own life. And I never imagined that on this very day, that new path would open with the low growl of a luxury car engine, and with words of profound gratitude I never thought I'd hear during my moment of deepest humiliation. The black car pulled away from the country club, leaving behind the muffled sounds of wedding music and a wall of people who, just moments before, had shamelessly tried to push me into the dirt. Through the tinted glass, I could still see Agnes's figure planted at the entrance, her lips moving as if trying to call me back, not knowing how. In a matter of minutes, her tone had flipped from get out to sweetheart, as fast as flipping a coin. That sudden shift chilled my blood, because I knew it wasn't affection. It was fear. Arthur sat across from me in the spacious back seat, his posture straight, but the dark circles under his eyes were evident. He probably hadn't slept all night either. The bodyguard sat up front, the assistant next to the driver. No one said a word. The car smelled of new leather and a very subtle cologne, but I didn't feel comfortable. I was still wearing my simple wedding dress, the neckline slightly skewed from dressing in such a rush, my hair pinned up haphazardly with several loose strands falling around my face. I looked at my reflection in the window and felt like a runaway bride fleeing her own disaster. Arthur was the first to speak, his tone calm, as if he feared exhausting me further. Sarah, do you need me to take you home to rest, or would you prefer to go back to the hospital? Hearing the words, do you need anything, put a lump in my throat. Since the morning, all I had been asked was, how dare you show up? What do you think this family is? Get out. No one had asked me what I needed. I pressed my lips together for a moment so my voice wouldn't tremble. I just want to sit down for a minute. I'm feeling a little dizzy. Arthur nodded, signaled the driver to slow down, and told his assistant, find a quiet place. A small coffee shop, nothing flashy. The car turned onto a tree-lined street. I looked out the window. The city was as busy as ever. People came and went without a care in the world. Nobody knew I had just been kicked out of my own wedding. Sometimes the saddest part isn't the tragedy itself, but the fact that it happens in the middle of everyday life, as if your pain doesn't make the world stop turning for even a second. The coffee shop Arthur chose was in a quiet neighborhood, with a beautiful blooming bougainvillea hanging over the entrance. He didn't walk in right away. He opened his door, turned back to me, and said quietly, take your time. If you need anything, just say the word. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling a bit weak, but I forced myself to stand tall. Inside, the shop was almost empty. There was only soft jazz playing and the rich aroma of roasted coffee. We chose a table by the window. Arthur sat across from me, but he didn't stare with burning curiosity. He looked at me with a measured respect that helped me relax. I ordered a glass of warm water. I didn't want anything sweet. I just needed something grounding. Arthur placed a slender envelope on the table in front of me. This is a small gesture of my gratitude. Please, don't reject it right away. I know doctors have their ethics, but this isn't money to buy a favor. It's a thank you for you and your family. I looked at the envelope and felt my heart shrink. I had heard many stories of patients offering envelopes and doctors refusing them. People sometimes thought the doctor was offended, but with Arthur, I could tell he wasn't trying to make me uncomfortable. He was genuinely searching for a way to lift some of the weight off my shoulders. I gently pushed the envelope back toward him. Arthur, with all sincerity, I cannot accept this. I'm a surgeon. I save people because it's my job. If everyone paid extra for their lives, people's consciences would just become a marketplace. I don't want that. Arthur sighed. almost as if he had anticipated this. He put the envelope away without insisting. I respect your decision, but I still want to do something for you, at least so you don't feel entirely alone today. Hearing the word alone felt like a physical pang in my chest. Because it was true. At my age, I didn't fear being broke or working hard. I only feared that awful sensation of being discarded like a broken toy. I looked up, meeting Arthur's eyes directly. You know what just happened at the entrance of the hotel, don't you? Arthur stayed silent for a few seconds, then nodded. I heard everything. I didn't intend to pry into your private matters, but I couldn't just stand there and watch them insult you like that. You had literally just saved my son, and they had the audacity. I let out a dry laugh, but my eyes started to burn. Arthur, please don't say it's because I saved your son. Even if I hadn't saved anyone today, I still wouldn't deserve to be treated like that. I was late because of an emergency. I didn't abandon anyone. I just did what I believed was right. At that point, the lump in my throat became unbearable. I turned my face toward the window, terrified I was going to break down. I didn't want to cry in front of a stranger. But then the realization hit me. This complete stranger was treating me with more kindness and humanity than the people I was about to call family. Arthur didn't try to comfort me with grand philosophical words. He just said softly, "Doctor, Sarah, do you have a mother?" I nodded, yes. My mom's name is Irene. She's probably at home waiting for news. And she hasn't been feeling well lately. I want to tell her, but I don't know how. Arthur looked at me for a moment longer, then said, "Call her. If you're afraid of upsetting her, just tell her you're okay first, and you can explain the rest little by little." With trembling hands, I dialed her number. The phone rang a few times before I heard my mother's voice, strained with worry. "Sarah, honey, where are you? Why weren't you answering? Did they say anything to you over there? Did you make it in time?" Just hearing Sarah, honey made me want to burst into tears. I took a deep breath, trying to sound as normal as possible. "Mom, it's me. I'm fine. Don't worry." I stepped out for a bit. "I'll come see you soon." My mother went silent for a second, as if she were carefully listening to my breathing over the line. "Something happened to you, didn't it?" I bit my lip. I couldn't just blurt out that I had been kicked out of my own wedding. I was afraid it would cause her blood pressure to spike. I just said, "Mom, early this morning I had to handle a very severe emergency with a little kid. I was late, and Greg's family is a bit upset. I'll come home and tell you everything. Have you eaten? Did you take your medication?" My mother sighed. Her voice softened, always worrying about everyone else. "And your own life? All I care about is that you're okay, honey. Listen to me. Don't let anyone walk all over you. I'm an old woman. I can handle the shock. Don't be afraid for me." I closed my eyes. My mother was always like this. She spoke little, but her love was a fortress. I said okay and hung up. When I lowered the phone, I realized my eyes were wet. I wiped them quickly, but Arthur saw. He didn't ask any more questions. He just pushed the glass of warm water closer to me. I took a sip. The warmth seemed to soothe my tight throat. I spoke in a quieter voice. "Arthur, did you go to the venue just to thank me?" Arthur nodded, then shook his head slightly, as if weighing his words. "Initially, yes. It was just to say thank you. But when I got to the hospital, they told me you had taken the day off to get married. I thought someone as dedicated as you must be the absolute pride of her family. I wanted to thank you in front of your loved ones so they would know what you had done. Who would have thought?" He stopped, frowning slightly. "Who would have thought they would turn your wedding into a humiliation?" I smiled bitterly. "Because they thought I was just an ordinary doctor. They thought I didn't have anyone powerful backing me up. They thought I just had to swallow it." Arthur looked at me, his voice firm. "You don't need anyone backing you up to be respected. But if you wish, I am willing to help you resolve this immediate problem so you can live in peace." I shook my head. "The problem isn't them. The problem is that I trusted Greg." Mentioning his name sent a sharp pain through my chest, like a needle being driven into my heart. I remembered Greg's face when he proposed, telling me he would protect me, that he wouldn't let his mother make things difficult for me. I remembered the times he held my hand and said, "You do your job. I understand you." And now, just because I was absent for a few hours to save a life, He could stand at an altar and marry someone else? Or did they force him? Or was he just weak? Or was he already willing to let me go long before today? Arthur asked gently, "Do you want to see Greg to clear things up?" I stayed silent for a long time, then said, almost as if speaking to myself, "I'll see him." But not to beg. Just to close the chapter. To close it for good. My phone vibrated on the table. The screen flashed with Agnes's name. I didn't have it saved, but I had memorized the number. I stared at it for a few seconds, then silenced it. Immediately after, Ian's number called. I silenced that too. Then another unknown number. I knew they were panicking. Arthur glanced at the screen without asking. I put the phone in my purse and said, "Arthur, thank you, but this is something I have to overcome on my own." "Could you do me one favor, though?" Arthur nodded. "Name it." I looked him straight in the eyes. "Have someone drive me to my mother's house. I need to get there before they show up to make a scene." Arthur didn't hesitate. "Done. My assistant will accompany you. No one will be allowed to bother you or your mother." I stood up, my legs feeling much steadier. The pain was still there, but it was starting to transform into something else, a reminder. I might fall, but I would not allow myself to be trampled again. When I stepped out of the cafe, a gentle breeze brushed my face. Suddenly, the air on the street felt much more breathable than the stuffy atmosphere of the country club. I didn't know what the road ahead held, but I knew I had to go back to my mother, Irene, first, because even if the whole world turned its back on me, my home was the only place where someone called me with a trembling, loving voice. "Sarah, honey." The car pulled up in front of the familiar, modest street where my mother lived. The sun was high in the sky now, glaring off the old shingled roof of her house. I looked at the small porch and felt my heart clench. Since my dad passed away, my mom lived here alone. Because I was always so busy at the hospital, I could usually only drop by late at night. Today, I was supposed to take her to the wedding, hold her hand as we walked into the ballroom, so she would feel at peace knowing her daughter had a solid shoulder to lean on. And now, I was returning in a half-buttoned wedding dress, carrying a storm inside my soul. Arthur's assistant stayed a few steps back, keeping a very respectful distance. I took a deep breath, telling myself I had to be strong. I couldn't let my mother see me fall apart. I barely pushed the front door open, and she was already there. She was wearing an old beige blouse and still holding a dish towel. When she saw me, her eyes lit up, but then stopped dead when she took in my disheveled dress and messy hair. She didn't ask questions immediately. She just pulled me inside, closing the door softly, as if she were afraid the wind would eavesdrop on our conversation. "Sit down first," she said with a strange, eerie calm. "Drink some water." I sat at the kitchen table, holding the glass of room-temperature water she poured for me. The water rippled with the shaking of my hands. My mother looked closely at my face, then touched my forehead. "You're exhausted, aren't you? Look at the bags under your eyes." I shook my head, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Mom." She didn't smile back. She sat across from me and sighed deeply. "Sarah, tell me exactly what happened." I knew I couldn't hide it from her. I put the glass down and took her thin, warm hand. "Mom, I was late. I had to do an emergency surgery. When I got to the venue, they blocked the doors. My mother-in-law, Agnes, said Greg had already married someone else." I spoke very slowly, laying out each word on the table like heavy stones. When I finished, I bowed my head. I was terrified to see my mother's expression. She stayed completely silent for a long time. I could only hear the ticking of the wall clock. Then, she asked in a low but razor-sharp voice, "And Greg? Did he say anything to you?" I shook my head. I didn't even see him. My mother nodded, as if she understood everything. She stood up and walked to her bedroom. I heard the sound of a drawer opening. A moment later, she returned holding an old photograph of my father. She placed it on the table, looked at it for a second, and then said, "Your father used to teach me something. A good man shows his face in difficult times. A weak man hides. Greg has chosen to hide." I bit my lip. My tears finally fell, splashing onto my mother's hand. She didn't wipe them away. She just patted my hand gently. "Cry, honey. Cry as much as you need to. Don't keep it bottled up inside. I broke down. Not wailing, but crying with a tight throat in heavy waves. I told my mother everything that had happened at the hotel entrance, every hurtful word, every glaring look. She listened. Her face grew pale, but her posture remained impeccably straight. When I told her about Arthur showing up, she frowned and asked for details. I told her everything without adding or omitting a single fact. When I finished, she sighed. Saving a life is a blessing, but that blessing isn't something to show off, and much less something for others to take advantage of. Remember this, Sarah. Don't go getting soft just because someone has money. I nodded. I know. I just asked him to give me a ride so I could get here in time. I was afraid Greg's family would come here to make a scene. My mother looked toward the front door, her voice resolute. If they come, I will do the talking. You stay out of sight. Her words were calm, but I felt as if an impenetrable wall had just been erected in front of me. Right at that moment, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was Greg's number. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. My mother saw it and said quietly, "Answer it. Make everything crystal clear." I picked up the call. Yes? Greg's voice on the other end sounded hoarse and desperate. Sarah? Where are you? I answered curtly. At my mother's house. Greg went quiet for a second, then started speaking rapidly, as if afraid I would hang up. I'm so sorry. Things aren't what you think. This morning, my mom caused a massive scene. The thing with Claire. It was just a symbolic ceremony to calm her down. It doesn't mean anything. I smiled, a hollow, sad smile. It doesn't mean anything, and yet you stood at an altar and married her? They forced me. You know how my mother is. I don't want to lose you, Sarah. Please, come back and we can talk. I looked at my mom. She shook her head, very softly. I turned my attention back to the phone. My voice was unnervingly calm. Greg, do you know where I was early this morning? I know. You were in surgery. I operated for 4 hours to save a 5-year-old boy. During those 4 hours, where were you? Greg stammered. I was at the venue, worried sick. I continued without raising my voice. If, during those hours, you had come to the hospital to wait outside the OR, even if you just stood there today, would be entirely different. But you chose to stand at an altar with someone else. I don't blame your mother, Greg. I blame you. On the other end, dead silence. I could only hear his ragged breathing. Sarah, please, give me a chance. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. That chance is something you burned through this morning. We're done. I hung up. My hands were shaking, but a profound wave of relief washed over me, as if I had just thrown off a massive boulder I'd been dragging around for years. I barely had time to catch my breath when I heard the screech of tires braking hard outside, followed by a commotion of voices. My heart skipped a beat. My mother stood up immediately and walked toward the door. I tried to follow her, but she turned and held up a hand. Stay put. Through the crack in the blinds, I saw Agnes standing on the porch. Her face was pale, but she was forcing a strained, polite smile. Beside her stood Ian and a few other relatives. Irene, please. Agnes called out in a sickeningly sweet voice. We've come to apologize. What happened this morning was a terrible misunderstanding. My mother opened the door just enough to block the threshold with her body. What misunderstanding? Agnes launched into a litany of excuses that it was wedding jitters, that it was a huge mistake, that she had always thought of Sarah as her own daughter. My mother listened without interrupting once. When Agnes finally ran out of breath, my mom spoke slowly. You think of my daughter as your own, and yet this morning you told her to get out? Agnes was left completely speechless. Ian tried to step in. Ma'am, these are just family matters. Sarah is our daughter-in-law. My mother cut him off. Her voice was still low, but it possessed the density of steel. If there is no wedding, there is no daughter-in-law. And if he has already married someone else, even less so. Ian's face flushed bright red. Agnes switched to a pleading tone. Please, Irene, try to understand us. Sarah is an outstanding girl. Our family cherishes her. Let her come back to us, I promise you. My mother smiled sadly. When did you cherish her? When she was in an operating room saving a life, did you cherish her? When you blocked her at the door to her own wedding, did you cherish her? No one answered. My mother continued, pronouncing every single word with absolute clarity. My daughter is a surgeon. She saves lives because it is her calling, not so you can use her to save face at a country club. As of today, our families have absolutely nothing to do with each other. Leave. Agnes opened her mouth to say something else, but footsteps echoed from behind them. Arthur's assistant stepped onto the porch, his voice polite but incredibly firm. Excuse me, Dr. Sarah is not receiving any visitors. I must ask you to leave the property. Seeing a man in a tailored suit acting as security, Agnes panicked. Ian grabbed her arm, and they practically scrambled back to their cars, heads down. I watched them drive away through the blinds. I had no fear left, only a hollow space in my chest. My mother closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and walked back into the kitchen. She looked at me, her eyes red, but her voice was as gentle as a summer breeze. It's over now. Go rest, honey. I hugged her for the first time all day. For the first time all day, I finally felt safe. Mom, I'm so sorry. She stroked my hair. What are you apologizing for? You live your life with decency. That's the only thing that matters. That afternoon, I fell into a deep sleep on the couch. When I woke up, I saw a text message from Arthur. Are you and your mother okay? If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to tell me. I replied simply, we are okay. Thank you. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows on the porch. I sat next to my mom, listening to her tell old stories about my dad, about the hard times they had survived together. Suddenly, I understood that there are weddings that don't need fancy dresses or a string quartet. They are simply the moments when you choose to stand on the side of what is right, and you have your true family standing right there with you. That night, I decided to request a leave of absence from the hospital. I needed time for my mom and time for myself. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least I hadn't taken another step in the wrong direction. The following days passed much slower than I expected. There was no more wedding planning, no more frantic phone calls with vendors. There was only my mom's small house, the smell of drip coffee in the morning, and the constant hum of the box fan in the afternoon. I requested a week off, just as I had told my mother I would. At first, she objected, saying I was young, that my career was important, that if I took too much time off, the hospital staff would talk. But then, noticing the dark circles under my eyes, she went quiet and merely suggested, if you're going to rest, rest for real. Don't let your mind keep racing. I listened to her. Every morning I woke up early to make her breakfast and remind her to take her blood pressure medication. Sometimes my mother would look at me with a mix of deep love and sorrow. I used to worry that when you got married, you'd leave me all alone, she said one morning, then offered a faint smile without finishing the thought. I realized that out of this nightmare, something good had actually happened. At least now I could be by her side without having to rush over to my future mother-in-law's house to endure her passive-aggressive remarks about my cooking or my hours. The gossip spread faster than I anticipated. Within 2 days, the neighborhood ladies knew my wedding had been canceled. Some stopped by to check on me. Others lingered on the sidewalk, looking at our house with morbid curiosity. I didn't hide, nor did I offer any elaborate explanations. My mother, on the other hand, remained completely unfazed. To anyone who asked, she gave a single answer. My daughter did the right thing as a human being, and that is more than enough. On the afternoon of the third day, while I was folding laundry, my phone rang. It was the chief of surgery, Dr. Miller. I answered. His voice was gravelly, but warm. Sarah, how are you holding up? I'm doing okay, Dr. Miller. He hesitated for a second, then said, about what happened to you. Rumors are already flying around the hospital. Don't worry. Nobody here is blaming you. The operation you pulled off that morning was nothing short of a miracle. I gripped the phone tightly. Thank you, Dr. Miller. Next week we have a very complicated M&M conference, he continued. If you feel ready, come back. If not, take all the time you need. Your spot is safe here. I told him I'd be there and hung up. I sat in silence for a moment. It turned out that the place where I was most terrified of being judged was the place that understood me best. And the place I thought would be my lifelong refuge had been the first to throw me to the wolves. That night, while I was slicing some apples for my mom, we heard a car pull up outside again. I flinched purely on reflex. My mother placed her hand over mine. Relax. I'll go look. This time, it wasn't Greg's family. It was Arthur. He was standing on the porch, with no bodyguards and no assistant. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt, holding a brown paper bag of fresh fruit. When he saw my mom, he nodded respectfully. Good evening, Miss Irene. I'm Arthur. My mother eyed him with the sharp, assessing gaze of a woman who had seen a lot of life. You're the man from the other day. Yes, ma'am. I'm the father of the boy Dr. Sarah operated on. My mother nodded and pushed the screen door open. Come in. Arthur stepped inside. He glanced around the modest living room without a hint of surprise or condescension. He placed the bag of fruit on the kitchen table and said, The other day I left in a rush and didn't get to properly introduce myself. My mom sat down and looked him straight in the eye. Why are you really here? Arthur didn't beat around the bush. I came to say thank you again, and also to ask for permission. I know it's not the best timing, but I wanted to check on you and Sarah and see if there's anything you need help with. My mother stayed silent. I was standing near the hallway listening to every word. My mother wasn't easily swayed, especially by strangers, and even less so by wealthy men. After a long pause, she said, My daughter saved your son because it was her duty. You do not owe us anything. Arthur nodded. I understand that. I'm not here to pay off a debt with money. I just thought that during a difficult time for Sarah, if an outsider with zero expectations could help with anything, well, here I am. My mom looked at him again. Her expression softened just a fraction. Sarah, come out here. I walked into the kitchen. Arthur stood up and greeted me with a polite nod. Are you doing all right? I'm all right, I replied. I turned to my mom. Mom, Arthur just came to visit. My mother looked between the two of us. Have a seat. We sat around the small kitchen table. The atmosphere was slightly tense, but not uncomfortable. Arthur told us that his son was fully awake and had even asked for his dad after days of being in a coma. As he spoke about his boy, his voice grew incredibly tender. My mother sighed in relief. That is a true blessing. Arthur turned back to me. Sarah, the hospital mentioned you have a major clinical conference next week. When do you plan on going back? I'll be back, I said without hesitation. I've rested enough. Arthur smiled faintly. Good. You belong in a hospital much more than in those loud, pretentious country clubs. He didn't say it with malice, but I caught the underlying meaning. I smiled, a real smile, for the first time in days. Before leaving, Arthur stood up and addressed my mother. Miss Irene, if you ever need anything, please do not hesitate to reach out. I consider Sarah the savior of my family, which makes you like family to me too. My mother didn't explicitly accept the offer. She merely said, As long as you live a decent life and take good care of your son, that is enough for me. Arthur nodded respectfully and headed for the door. I walked him out. When we were alone on the porch, he spoke in a low voice. I don't want to pressure you. If you don't want to see me, I won't come back. I shook my head. You don't need to avoid me. I just need time. I understand, he said. I'll be waiting. Just as a friend. That night, as we were locking up, my mom asked me, What do you think of that man? I thought about it and answered honestly. I feel at peace around him. But I'm not ready to think about anything else. My mom nodded. Good. Don't rush. You can walk as slowly as you want through life, as long as you're walking in the right direction. The next day, I received a text from Claire. It was just one line. Sarah, I am so sorry. I didn't want things to end up like this. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally typing back. What's done is done. Focus on your own life. I wasn't as furiously angry with Claire as I thought I would be. I was just tired of relationships built on the weakness of the man standing in the middle. That evening, I sat on the porch listening to my mom talk about my dad. Your father's family opposed me too, she said, looking out at the street. But he never abandoned me. That's why I believe you judge a man's worth by where he chooses to stand when things get hard. I looked up at the sky. The stars were faint against the city glow. I thought of Greg and his broken promises. I no longer felt a sharp, stabbing pain, just an empty space that was slowly filling up with peace. The following week, I returned to the hospital. When I slipped my white coat back on, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. My colleagues looked at me without too much intrusive curiosity. They just nodded like it was any other Tuesday. When the bright lights of the OR turned on, I knew that here, at least, I wouldn't be abandoned. And I also knew my story wasn't over. I had just turned the page to a new chapter. Quieter, perhaps, but infinitely more real. The morning I officially returned to work, a light drizzle had been falling since dawn. The hospital entrance was busier than usual. The wailing of ambulance sirens was relentless, a sound so familiar that just hearing it confirmed I was in the right place. I buttoned my white coat, adjusted my ID badge that read Dr. Sarah, and looked at myself in the mirror for a second. My face still showed traces of exhaustion, but my eyes were different. They were no longer lost like they had been days ago, but anchored in a calm I had painstakingly rebuilt. Dr. Miller found me in the hallway. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just clapped me on the shoulder. "Get to work, Sarah. We've got a trauma consult that needs you." His business-as-usual attitude was exactly what I needed. Here, I wasn't the jilted bride or the girl thrown out of her own wedding. I was a surgeon. The operation took much longer than expected. When I peeled off my gloves, I noticed my hands ached from the intense focus, but it was a familiar, satisfying ache. The strangest part was that during the entire procedure, my mind had been completely dialed in. Not once did I think about Greg, or Agnes, or the grand entrance of that hotel. I suddenly realized that some wounds start to heal on their own the moment you return to your true calling. As I walked out of the surgical wing, I saw Arthur standing at the end of the corridor. He didn't rush over, he just waited. When he saw me, he offered a small smile and nodded. I walked over to him. "Did you come to see your son?" "Yes," he replied. "He's fully alert now." He specifically asked to see Dr. Sarah. I walked with him to the pediatric ICU. The little boy was sitting up in bed, looking miles healthier than the last time I saw him. When he saw me walk in, his face lit up and he gave a weak wave. "Hi, doctor." I gently took his small hand, feeling a warm rush of affection. "You are so brave, buddy. Be good, and listen to the nurses, okay?" Arthur stood beside me, his eyes glistening. He murmured, "You see? With just one chance to live, everything changes." I nodded, knowing his words carried a weight far beyond the little boy in the bed. When we stepped out of the room, Arthur asked, "Are you busy this evening? I'd like to officially take you and your mother out to dinner to say thank you. If it's too much, I completely understand." I hesitated for a beat, then answered honestly, "I'll have to ask my mom. She doesn't really like crowded, fancy places." Arthur smiled. "Then we'll eat at a small diner near your house. Nothing formal." That afternoon, I went to pick up my mom. She wore a simple dress, her hair neatly styled. On the way to the restaurant, she asked me, "This Arthur, what's your read on him?" I thought about it. He seems like a decent man, but I really don't want to think beyond that right now. My mom nodded. "You're doing the right thing." The dinner was incredibly relaxed. Arthur didn't talk too much. He didn't boast about his tech empire, his money, or his status. He told us how his wife had passed away young, how he had raised his son completely alone, and how there were times, balancing boardrooms and pediatricians, when he thought he was going to break. My mother listened closely, her eyes softening. "Raising a child alone is a heavy burden," she said. "I know." I watched the two of them converse. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't the fiery rush of falling in love, but a deep sense of tranquility, watching two people who had actually lived through real hardships speak to each other with total sincerity. When we got back home, my mom said, "He's a good man. He's not impulsive, and he's not arrogant. But you take all the time you need, Sarah. Don't let anyone dictate your pace." I agreed. Later that night, I received a text from Greg. This time, he didn't apologize. He just asked, "Are you okay?" I stared at the text for a long time, then deleted it without replying. I knew we had absolutely nothing left to say to each other. But Greg didn't give up. 2 days later, he was waiting for me outside the hospital. I spotted him from a distance, looking haggard and unkempt. I tried to take a different exit, but he had already seen me. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice cracking. I stopped, maintaining a strict distance between us. "What do you want?" "I just want to talk for 5 minutes." I checked my watch. "Speak." Greg took a shaky breath. My mom realizes she made a huge mistake. She's been genuinely sick for days. She can't stop talking about you. Claire. Claire already moved out. I canceled everything with her. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. "And Sarah," he choked out. "I choose you. I'm choosing you now." I smiled. A smile devoid of any joy. "Greg, you aren't choosing me. You are choosing your own peace of mind. When your mother pressured you, you chose her so you wouldn't have to fight. Now that you've lost me and you're miserable, you're trying to crawl back. That isn't making a choice. That's taking the path of least resistance." Greg was left speechless. "I can change." I shook my head. There are things in life that can be fixed, but there are moments that, once lost, are lost forever. Greg stood in silence for a painfully long time, then finally asked, "Do you already have someone else?" I didn't lie, but I didn't owe him explanations either. "That has absolutely nothing to do with you anymore." He dropped his head. "I'm sorry. I already heard about him. And I'm already over it," I said. I turned around and walked away. I felt impossibly light, as if a physical tether had finally been snapped. I knew then that Greg was, officially and permanently, a ghost of the past. A few days later, my mother had to be admitted to the hospital for a sudden, severe spike in her blood pressure. I was terrified, but I kept my professional calm. I spent the entire night sitting in a chair next to her bed. Arthur somehow found out. He didn't blow up my phone. He just sent one message. "I'm here. If you need anything, tell me." The next morning, he showed up at the hospital room with a thermos of hot chicken noodle soup from a local deli. He didn't bombard me with questions. He just looked at my mom and said, "Rest easy, ma'am. With Sarah right here, you'll bounce back in no time." My mother looked at him and managed a weak smile. "Having you here makes me feel like my daughter actually has someone in her corner." I stopped pouring the soup and looked at her. She squeezed my hand. "I mean it. Whether you lean on him or not is entirely up to you." Arthur stood up and said quietly, "I'm going to step out for a minute and let you two eat." When we were alone, my mom looked at me for a long time. "Sarah, what are you most afraid of right now?" I thought about it. Trusting the wrong person again. She nodded. "It's completely normal to be afraid. But don't let that fear board up your doors. Just remember, whoever enters your life needs to be brave enough to stand right beside you when the roof caves in." I stayed silent. I thought of Arthur. I thought of the look in his eyes that day at the country club entrance. He didn't ask who was right or wrong. He only asked if I was okay. And last night it was the same. He didn't ask what I wanted him to do. He just told me he was there. That evening, I sat alone in the hospital corridor near the vending machines. It had started to rain again. I realized that my failed wedding no longer hurt me. I was just learning how to trust again slowly, with intense caution, but without shutting myself off from the world. The road ahead was long. I didn't know for sure who I would choose or how long I would walk alone, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would never walk backward again. After the night my mother spent in the hospital, my life slowed down, as if someone had turned the volume of the world way down. I went from the hospital floor to my mother's room, a straight, unwavering line. Her room was on the 3rd floor of the internal medicine wing, with a window that looked out over a row of oak trees. Every morning, the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting bright, dancing spots across her blankets. My mom said watching those leaves gave her more peace than being at home. I got used to waking up early to make her a warm casserole or soup and bringing it in Tupperware. One afternoon, I was so bone-tired that I fell asleep in the awful plastic chair beside her bed. When I woke up, I found my mother awkwardly trying to drape a blanket over my shoulders with her shaking hand. I gently caught her hand and whispered, "Go to sleep, Mom. I still have energy." She looked at me with an expression that was both deeply tender and dead serious. Don't force yourself, Sarah. If you make a habit of pretending you're strong, when you're finally, truly exhausted, you will completely collapse. I never forgot those words. Arthur kept visiting, but he always maintained a respectful distance. Sometimes he would just peek his head in the doorway and ask, "How is Miss Irene doing today?" After I gave him an update, he would nod and leave. Other times, he would leave some fresh fruit or magazines on the bedside table and chat briefly with my mom. She no longer looked at him with suspicion, but she kept her guard up. She knew better than anyone that what comes too fast usually leaves just as quickly. One evening, as I was finishing my shift, Arthur called me. His voice was deep, carrying a hint of hesitation. "Sarah, are you free tonight? I wanted to ask you a favor." I checked my watch. "Tell me." "My son spiked a fever again last night. The on-call pediatrician already checked him, and he's physically fine, but he won't stop asking for you. I know it's an imposition, but if you could just drop by and say a few words to him." I didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." The pediatric wing was much quieter than during the morning rounds. The little boy was facing away from the door. But when he heard me walk in, he turned, his eyes lighting up. "You came!" I sat on the edge of the bed and felt his forehead. "I'm right here. You have to be good and do what the doctors say, okay?" The boy grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Arthur stood a few feet back, his eyes red. When the boy finally drifted off to sleep, Arthur led me out into the hallway. "I'm so sorry to bother you with this." "It's no bother," I replied softly. "When kids are scared, they cling to whoever makes them feel safe. It's completely normal." Arthur looked at me for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Sarah, I know you're cautious. I don't want to cross any boundaries, but I also don't want to pretend that I don't feel anything. I care about you deeply." I stayed silent. Not out of shock, but because I had felt it coming, I decided to be completely direct. "Arthur, I just walked out of a marriage that didn't even start. I need time. I don't want anyone waiting around for me in vain." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I don't need you to promise me anything. I just ask one thing. Allow me to be by your side when you need me." His approach wasn't pushy or suffocating. I felt my racing heart begin to settle. "If you want to be by my side as a friend, I accept that. Deal," he replied with a faint, genuine smile. In the days that followed, I threw myself back into my work. Surgeries, consults, clinical rounds. Sometimes I was so exhausted I just wanted to sit in a dark room in silence. But every time I saw a patient turn the corner and recover, I felt my own strength returning. I realized my profession had saved me not just because of the purpose it gave me, but because it demanded all my focus exactly when I needed a distraction. News about Greg's family reached me occasionally through the hospital grapevine. A nurse who knew them told me, "Agnes is actually sick. She won't stop talking about how they ruined everything." Greg asked for a transfer. Claire moved out of state. I listened, but it didn't affect my pulse. It was like hearing a story about strangers on the news. One evening, my mother was doing well enough that the attending physician discharged her. I drove her home, set up her bedroom, and moved her favorite armchair closer to the window. My mom watched me fuss over the pillows and then said, "Sarah, let me ask you something honestly. Are you angry with me for not warning you about Greg sooner?" I turned around. "Did you warn me, Mom? Because I think I was the one who refused to listen." My mom smiled sadly. "You're just like your father. You trust people too much." I sat on the edge of her bed. "Mom, if I didn't trust people, I couldn't do what I do for a living." She nodded. "That's true. But you have to know who to trust. Remember that." That night, Arthur dropped by with some premium vitamins for my mom. She accepted them, saying, "You shouldn't be wasting your money." Arthur replied smoothly, "I consider you family." My mom looked at him, this time without averting her gaze. "Have a seat. I want to ask you a question." Arthur sat down, his posture impeccable. "Go ahead, ma'am. What exactly are your intentions with my daughter?" My mom fired point blank. I jumped slightly. Arthur stayed quiet for a few seconds, then answered calmly. "If Sarah permits it, I would like to date her seriously. If she isn't ready, I will remain by her side as a friend, without overstepping." My mother studied his face, then turned to me. Did you hear that? I nodded. My heart was thumping against my ribs. My mother turned her sharp gaze back to Arthur. I don't care if you're a billionaire. I just need to know that when things get ugly, you will stand by her side and you won't throw her to the wolves. Arthur answered with absolute conviction. You have my word. My mom let out a breath, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off her chest. All right. But I'm warning you. It is not going to be easy for this girl to trust again. Arthur smiled. I know. After that night, nothing changed drastically. But an invisible thread now connected us. I no longer kept my guard up around him, though we didn't rush forward either. We talked more about our jobs, about his son, about the mundane fears of everyday life. I knew he had also suffered a massive loss, which was why he was in no hurry. Once, while driving back from picking up my mom's prescription, I asked him, Aren't you scared? Scared of what? Of starting a relationship when both of us have so many scars. He kept his eyes on the road and said slowly, Of course I'm scared. But what scares me the most is never having the guts to take the leap. That answer stayed with me. That night, sitting alone on my front porch, feeling the cool evening breeze, I realized that my heart wasn't dead-bolted shut like it had been those first few days. I was slowly cracking the door open, letting the light in, but making sure the wind didn't blow too hard. I didn't know what the future held. All I knew was that I was moving at my own pace, without anyone pushing or dragging me. And this time, if I decided to fall in love, I would do it with my eyes wide open, and a heart that knew how to protect itself. After that blunt conversation between my mother and Arthur, the little house felt more peaceful. Not because the storm had totally passed, but because everyone had laid their cards on the table, leaving nothing hovering in the air. I noticed that my mom no longer looked at Arthur with a raised eyebrow, but rather with the quiet observation of a seasoned mother assessing if a man was strong enough to anchor her daughter. As for me, I kept my head down at the hospital, but I carried a strange new sense of support inside me. Not because I had a rich man behind me, but because I knew that if something went wrong, there was someone willing to just listen, without interrupting, without offering unsolicited advice. And that alone felt like hitting the lottery. One afternoon, right as I finished my shift, Dr. Miller called me into his office. He was leaning against his windowsill, holding a manila folder, his expression grave. Sarah, have you heard anything from Greg's family recently? I shook my head. I have zero contact with them. Dr. Miller sighed heavily. They just filed a formal complaint against you with the hospital's medical board. I felt my blood run cold. A formal complaint? Yes, he nodded. They are claiming that you abandoned your post on the day of your wedding, damaging the reputation of the groom's family. They are also heavily implying that you used an emergency surgery to network with a high-net-worth individual. For a second, the room spun. I couldn't believe they had stooped this low. I gripped the edge of his desk. And what is the hospital going to do? Dr. Miller looked at me with deep seriousness, but no hostility. The hospital has already run an internal review. The surgical report is flawless. The on-call team corroborated your timeline perfectly. You did absolutely nothing wrong, Sarah. But this is going to be an administrative headache. They are trying to make a massive PR stink out of it. I took a deep breath. I'm not afraid of an investigation. I'm just terrified my mother will find out. Dr. Miller nodded sympathetically. I get it. You just keep doing your job. Let HR and legal handle the rest. That night, I didn't say a word to my mom, but she seemed to sense it. As I was washing the dinner dishes, she asked, What happened today? You look like you've seen a ghost. I was going to lie, but I ended up telling her everything. Greg's family filed a formal complaint at the hospital. My mom put down her tea mug and stared at me for a long time. What more do they want from you? They say I ruined their family's honor. My mother let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The honor they themselves dragged through the mud by having a fake wedding to save face at a country club? I dried my hands and held hers. I'm not scared, Mom. I'm just worried that you're going to worry. My mom patted my cheek. Don't underestimate me, Sarah. I might be old, but I'm not so fragile that I can't weather this. If you did the right thing, you walk into that hospital with your head held high. The next day, Arthur found out through Dr. Miller. He called me immediately. His tone was low, but razor sharp. Sarah, do not worry about this. I've already spoken to my legal team. If they continue to defame you, I will personally testify on your behalf. I will tell the board exactly what I saw that morning. I was quiet for a moment. You don't need to do that. I don't want to drag you into this mess, Arthur replied instantly. You aren't dragging me anywhere. I am stepping in voluntarily. Because you don't deserve this. His words hit me right in the chest. I remembered the day at the hotel entrance when he had planted himself in front of me, not asking for context, just asking if I was okay. Now, he was doing the exact same thing. He wasn't asking what PR spin to use, he was just saying he'd be on the stand. A few days later, the hospital convened an official meeting. Present were department heads, a hospital lawyer, and a representative for Greg's family. It was Ian. He sat across the long mahogany table, refusing to meet my eyes. When the board pressed him for details, he talked in circles, unable to provide a single piece of evidence beyond his mother's wounded pride. I sat calmly and laid out the exact timeline, from the moment my pager went off to the moment they physically blocked me at the venue doors. I didn't embellish, I didn't complain, I just stated the absolute facts. When I mentioned Arthur pulling up in his car to thank me, Ian stared at the table. He probably realized that his mother's spite had escalated into something they couldn't control. The meeting concluded with a swift and decisive resolution. I was cleared of any wrongdoing. The complaint was officially dismissed. When I walked out of the boardroom, my legs felt like jelly. I wasn't ecstatic. I was just bone, tired. It was a completely unnecessary battle, but one I had to fight. Arthur was waiting in the lobby. When he saw me, he stood up. Is it over? Yes, I breathed. He nodded. Let's go get some food. I think you need a massive burger. I actually laughed. You're very practical. We ate at a classic American diner a few blocks away. We didn't talk about the hospital drama anymore. We just talked about normal things. He told me his son had started running around the house again and was telling everyone he wanted to be a surgeon when he grew up. Listening to him anchored me, but I knew the storm hadn't entirely passed. A few days later, Greg showed up at my house. I was still at work. My mom was home alone. When I pulled into the driveway, I found my mom sitting in the living room, looking pale. Greg was sitting across from her, his head buried in his hands. He came to apologize, my mom said, before I could even take my coat off. I looked at Greg. He had lost a lot of weight. What are you doing here? Greg spoke in a hollow voice. I know I messed up. My mom went completely off the deep end. I never imagined she would file a complaint with your hospital. I smiled. A tight, cold smile. You didn't imagine it, or you were just too cowardly to stop her? Greg didn't answer. My mom stepped in. Greg, I don't hold any hatred in my heart for you. But you are far too late. Greg looked up, his eyes bloodshot. Please, just give me one chance to fix this. My mom shook her head. Life doesn't just put opportunities on pause while you figure things out. Leave. Don't make this any more pathetic than it already is. Greg turned to me. Sarah. I cut him off, my voice steady. Go. I am perfectly fine. You need to figure out how to live your own life decently. Greg lingered for a few agonizing seconds, then finally stood up and walked out the door. When it clicked shut, my mom sighed deeply. You see, honey? People only come crawling back when they've run out of other options. I hugged her from behind. I don't regret a single thing anymore. That night, I texted Arthur. It's all over. He replied quickly. Good. Now, get some sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened. From the catastrophic wedding day to the hospital complaint, from the sheer agony to the quiet peace I felt right now, I was no longer the submissive girl trying to please a nightmare mother-in-law. I had learned how to stand tall without forcing it, and how to protect my boundaries without lowering my head. And I knew this story was leading me to a new crossroads, where I would have to make choices not just with my heart, but with a hard-earned maturity. After Greg left, a profound silence took over the living room, like the eerie calm that follows a violent thunderstorm. My mother sat in her chair for a long time, staring out at the small backyard where she tended her tomato plants. I brewed a cup of herbal tea and placed it in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice was as solid as rock. You see, People beg for forgiveness when they have no options left, not because they actually comprehend the damage they've caused. I sat on the sofa beside her. I know. I expect absolutely nothing from him anymore. My mom nodded and turned to me, her gaze a mixture of sternness and deep maternal love. Sarah, consider that chapter permanently closed. Don't let him drag you back into his mess for a second time. They can hurt you once, but if they hurt you twice, it's because you left the door open. I nodded in silence. My heart wasn't racing anymore. There was an empty space inside me, but it wasn't a cold void. It was the satisfying emptiness of a room that had finally been deep cleaned. A sense of pure relief, even if I hadn't put any new furniture in it yet. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the hospital. It was a brutal season for the surgical ward, back-to-back operations, endless consults. There were night shifts where, by dawn, I was slumped against the break room wall drinking lukewarm drip coffee, my eyes burning. But strangely, I didn't feel the soul-crushing exhaustion I used to. Maybe because my mind was no longer tethered to a broken relationship. Arthur kept his word. He stayed close, but never pushed. Sometimes a whole week would pass where we only exchanged short text messages asking about my mom's blood pressure, or if I was getting enough sleep. Not a single rushed romantic declaration, not a single heavy promise. It was precisely that measured restraint that made me feel so incredibly safe. One Friday afternoon, as I was charting my last patient, Arthur texted me, "Sarah, my son is officially getting discharged from outpatient follow-up this weekend. If you have some free time, I'd love to invite you and your mom over to my house for lunch. It's not a big party, just a family meal." I read the message and chewed on my lip for a while. I asked my mom. She sat in silence, then said, "Go, Sarah. Go so you can see exactly how he lives, what his house feels like, how he raises his boy. Observe everything very carefully, and then make your own decision." I nodded. I understood she wasn't pressuring me. She was giving me her blessing to explore. Arthur's house was in a quiet, affluent suburb outside the city limits. It wasn't an ostentatious mansion, but rather a beautifully designed, sprawling two-story craftsman home with a large front yard where I immediately heard the sound of a kid laughing. When we parked, his son came sprinting out the front door. When he saw me, he yelled happily, "Dr. Sarah!" I crouched down and caught him in a hug, feeling a sudden, immense wave of tenderness. My mother watched the scene from the driveway, and her expression softened considerably. Lunch was simple. Arthur had grilled some steaks and made a salad, nothing overly complicated, but everything was immaculate. My mom insisted on helping clear the table. The two of them chatted easily, as if they were old neighbors. I paid close attention to how Arthur spoke to his son, gentle but with clear boundaries and firmness. When the boy finished eating, he picked up his plate and proudly brought it to the sink to show me. It was obvious this was a home with solid routines, a family that didn't need to put on a show for guests. After lunch, my mom announced she wanted to go sit on the patio to enjoy the breeze. I knew she was doing it on purpose to give us a moment alone. Arthur and I stayed in the living room. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows. Arthur was the first to speak. "Sarah, I invited you today not to put pressure on you. I just wanted you to see my real life, so that whatever decision you make it knowing exactly what you're walking into." I looked at him. "Aren't you afraid that seeing all this might make me run away?" He smiled slightly. "Of course I am. But what I'm more afraid of is starting something built on an illusion." His absolute transparency left me momentarily speechless. I realized that after everything I had been through, I had developed a hypersensitivity to bullshit. And Arthur, by laying everything bare, was respecting that sensitivity entirely. On the drive back, my mom didn't say much. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, she asked, "What did you think of today?" I thought for a second. I felt peaceful. My mom nodded. "Peace is a beautiful thing, Sarah. But don't rush to anchor your whole life to it just yet. Let time give you the final answer." A week later, the hospital hosted a statewide clinical symposium. I was selected to present a case study on a highly complex pediatric trauma surgery, specifically the surgery that had made me late to my wedding. Standing at the podium, looking out at the auditorium filled with top surgeons, I saw Dr. Miller in the front row, nodding encouragingly. I spoke clearly, detailing the procedure without skipping a beat. When I finished, the entire room broke into applause. I bowed my head slightly. A very different emotion washed over me. It wasn't ego, it was validation. The absolute confirmation that on that morning, I had made the right choice. Following the symposium, I received an invitation to join an elite, specialized surgical research team. It was an opportunity that would consume even more of my time, but it would skyrocket my career trajectory. I told my mom about it. She thought about it for a minute, then said, "Take it, honey. I can take care of myself." I looked at her, noticing how much more silver was in her hair now. "I'm terrified of leaving you alone too much." My mom smiled warmly. "I am not alone. I have you, and I get to watch you build your life. I refuse to be an anchor holding you back." That evening, I texted Arthur about the research group. He replied with one line, "Congratulations, I knew you'd get it." He didn't ask if I was stressed. He didn't whine about how it would affect our time together. Just a concise, rock-solid vote of confidence. I realized that the best kind of support doesn't always need to be breathing down your neck. It just needs to be a steady wall you can lean on when you're tired. But just when my life felt like it was cruising on a smooth highway, I got a call from an unknown number. On the other end was a weak, raspy voice. "Agnes. Sarah. It's me. I wanted to see you." I froze. A sudden cocktail of old anxiety and anger surged up, then quickly sank back down. I looked at my mom sitting across the room. She couldn't hear the call, but my face told her everything. "Who is it?" she mouthed. "Agnes," I whispered back. My mom stayed quiet for a long moment, then said slowly, "You don't owe them a damn thing. But if you feel you need to close this chapter one last time for your own sanity, go. I won't stop you." I got back on the phone and agreed to meet Agnes at a Starbucks near the hospital, a very public place, in broad daylight. I wasn't scared, but I refused to put myself in a vulnerable position. Before walking in, I texted Arthur. "Dealing with a personal matter today. Might be out a little late." He replied instantly. "Do what you need to do. I'm right here." Those words demanding nothing, questioning nothing, were all the armor I needed. I didn't know if seeing Agnes would rip open an old wound or finally cauterize it. All I knew was that I would never let anyone dictate my worth again. I arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early. It was on a quiet corner, a few blocks from the hospital, not too crowded, the perfect neutral ground for a difficult conversation. I chose a booth by the window and ordered a hot green tea. I wrapped my hands around the cardboard cup, feeling the heat, but internally I was shockingly lucid. I wasn't trembling like I had been outside the country club, nor was I furious like during the hospital investigation. I just felt like I was reaching the end of a very long, exhausting road. Agnes arrived a few minutes late. When she walked through the door, it took me a second to recognize the woman who, with her hands on her hips, had publicly humiliated me. She looked frail now. She had lost weight, her shoulders were slumped, and she walked with a slow, heavy gait. She wore a dark, unremarkable cardigan, her gray roots were showing, and her face had lost all its haughty arrogance, replaced entirely by deep fatigue and timidity. She looked around, spotted me, and stopped. She hovered there for a second before approaching the table. I stood up, not out of submission, and not trying to be intimidating. I just gave her a curt nod. "Have a seat." Agnes slid into the booth, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. I ordered another hot tea for her. When the barista dropped it off, she whispered, "Thank you." We sat in Bori silence for a long time. The air was heavy, but not explosive. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice raspy. "Can I still call you Sarah?" I looked at her blankly. "Call me whatever you want." She took a shaky breath. "Sarah, that day, I was horribly wrong. I should have said these words to you a long time ago. I didn't feel a rush of vindication or immediate relief. I just listened." Agnes continued, her voice trembling more noticeably. "I didn't think things would escalate like that. I just had this old-school mentality that a daughter-in-law should always put her husband's family first. I was so used to that way of thinking." I took a sip of my tea. "You were used to it, but I couldn't survive living like that." She nodded frantically, as if terrified I would walk out. I know. Later, when I found out you had been operating on that billionaire's son, I realized that if you hadn't been there, that little boy might have died." I looked her dead in the eye. "Agnes, Even if I hadn't been operating on anyone important, even if it was a routine appendectomy, I still wouldn't have deserved to be treated the way you treated me. Agnes dropped her head. A single tear fell onto the laminate table. I know, I am so full of regret. But in that moment, I panicked. I was terrified of what our relatives would say. I was terrified of losing face. I offered a small, humorless smile. You were terrified of what strangers would think, but you weren't afraid of destroying the woman you were supposed to call a daughter. Those words finally broke her. She pulled a tissue from her purse, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. I didn't offer her a napkin. I didn't reach out to comfort her. I had shed enough tears over this family. Now it was her turn. After a few minutes, Agnes wiped her eyes and continued. Greg. He's not doing well. He asked for a transfer to a branch out in Ohio. He says he can't stand being in this city anymore. He blames me for everything. I listened, but my heart remained totally unmoved. That is an issue between you and your son. She looked up at me with a desperate, pleading gaze. Sarah, I wouldn't dare ask you to come back to him. I just want you to forgive me. I've aged 10 years in a few months, and when I sit alone and think about what I did, I realize how incredibly cruel I was. I stayed silent. Forgiveness isn't a magical word you just dispense the second someone asks for it. I thought about my mother, about the look of horror in her eyes when she heard Agnes had told me to get out. I thought about the nights I spent clutching my pillow, not because I missed Greg, but agonizing over what I had done wrong to deserve such viciousness when all I ever tried to do was live decently. I put my cup down and looked right at her. I don't harbor any hatred for you, Agnes, but I will never forget it either. I forgive you for the sake of my own peace of mind, not so things can go back to normal. She nodded, tears continuously streaming down her face. I understand. I don't dare hope for anything more. I slid out of the booth. Then, let's consider this matter permanently closed. From now on, please don't reach out to me again. Let's both just live our separate lives. Agnes stood up too, leaning heavily on the table. Sarah, I hope you find a man who actually knows your worth. I looked at her and gave a single nod. I expect nothing less. I walked out of the coffee shop and took a massive breath of fresh air. The afternoon sun was pale, not blinding. I felt remarkably light, as if I had finally dropped a suitcase full of bricks that I had been dragging around for months. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Arthur. Are you done? Yeah, I replied. Are you okay? I'm actually really okay. He didn't pry for details. He just said, I'm in the neighborhood. If you're up for it, let me buy you a real coffee. I didn't even hesitate. Sounds great. We met up at our usual quiet cafe. I told him about the entire conversation with Agnes, leaving nothing out. Arthur listened intently, never interrupting. When I finished, he just said one thing. You handled that perfectly. I looked at him. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. He nodded. No, it's not, but it lets you sleep with a clear conscience. His words made me smile. I realized that when I was with him, I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to prove I was the perfect submissive partner. I could just be Sarah. When I got home, my mom was out back watering her tomatoes. When she saw me, she asked, So? How did the meeting go? It's done. I closed the book on it. My mom nodded approvingly. Good. Some things in life require one final, ugly conversation so you never have to speak of them again. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the crazy roller coaster of the last year. I no longer felt a burning rage toward Agnes, nor a lingering grief for Greg. I just felt a quiet, solid maturity taking root inside me, unobtrusive, but entirely unbreakable. The next day, I officially accepted the spot on the elite research team. The new role was going to devour my schedule, and I knew there would be travel involved. I mentioned it to Arthur over dinner. He just smiled. We'll make it work. You do what you need to do. No guilt trips, no ultimatums. I realized this was the highest form of respect he could offer me. I didn't know exactly where my future with Arthur was headed, but I knew that as of today, I was no longer dragging the ghosts of my past behind me. I had closed a heavy door, ensuring that any new doors I opened would be walked through with absolute dignity. After that final closure with Agnes, My life entered a strange, beautiful new phase. There were no more dramatic storms, but there weren't fireworks every day, either. Everything moved with a steady, reassuring rhythm like a lake the morning after a hurricane. On the surface, it looked perfectly still, but underneath, the water had been entirely filtered and renewed. The surgical research group kicked off the following week. I was assigned to a highly specialized trauma unit, and the pressure was astronomical. Committee meetings dragged on until 9 at night. Staring at clinical trial data strained my eyes until they blurred. Sometimes I'd drive home when the city's skyline was already lit up against the pitch-black sky. My mom got into the habit of eating dinner early and keeping a plate wrapped in foil in the oven for me. Whenever I stumbled through the door, exhausted, she would just say, "Wash your hands and eat before your stomach turns into a knot." Those incredibly mundane, maternal phrases became my anchor to the real world. Arthur, for his part, never interfered with my chaotic schedule. He just checked in with perfectly timed, low-pressure texts. "Are you completely dead on your feet today? Did you manage to eat real food?" Sometimes I was scrubbing into a trauma case and didn't reply for 6 hours, and he never held it against me. His quiet, non-demanding presence made me feel deeply respected, never managed or controlled. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly grueling morbidity and mortality conference, Dr. Miller pulled me aside. "Sarah, next weekend the hospital is partnering with a nonprofit to run a free rural health clinic up in Appalachia. We need a solid trauma surgeon on the roster. Do you want in?" I thought about it for a grand total of 3 seconds. Yes. Put me on the list. I told my mom that evening. She just nodded as she stirred a pot on the stove. "Go, honey. Your father used to volunteer for those rural trips. They're good for the soul. They remind you why you put yourself through medical school in the first place." The morning we left, the sky was still pitch black. The chartered bus rolled out of the city, leaving the glowing skyscrapers behind. I sat by the window, watching the concrete turn into sprawling forests and winding mountain roads, feeling lighter than I had in months. It was the first time since the wedding disaster that I was traveling without feeling like I was running away from something. I was going because I wanted to be there. The trip lasted 3 grueling days. The conditions at the pop-up clinic were rough, limited supplies, endless lines of people who hadn't seen a doctor in years. But the sheer gratitude in their eyes wiped out any physical exhaustion I felt. On the second day, a frail, elderly woman gripped my hand with her calloused fingers and whispered, "Doc, you got the exact same eyes as my late daughter." I smiled, feeling a sudden lump form in my throat. That night, while the rest of the medical team was crashing on cots in the local high school gym, I stepped outside into the cool mountain air. The sky was an ocean of brilliant stars. My phone buzzed. It was Arthur. "Did you make it up the mountain in one piece?" "Yeah," I smiled into the receiver. "It's incredibly quiet up here." He chuckled. A low, warm sound. I figured. "You've always seemed like the kind of person who thrives in places like that." I went quiet for a moment, listening to the crickets. Then, I said something I hadn't planned on saying. "Arthur, I'm scared." "Scared of what?" he asked instantly, his tone shifting to pure attention. "I'm scared of getting used to this peace. I'm scared that the second I get comfortable, the rug is going to get pulled out from under me again. I'm terrified I won't have the strength to survive another humiliation." He didn't reply with a quick cliché. He let the silence hang for a few seconds. Then, he spoke slowly, his voice dropping an octave. "Sarah, I cannot promise you that life won't throw any more curveballs at you, but I can absolutely promise you that when they come, you will not be standing in the batter's box alone." It wasn't a fairy tale vow. It was a deeply human, grounded commitment. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. "Thank you." When I got back to the city, my mom was waiting for me on the porch. She looked me up and down and frowned. "You look like you lost 5 pounds." "I'm fine, Mom," I laughed. She shook her head and ushered me inside. "Skinny, but your eyes are shining." I guess that's the part that matters. That night, as I was tossing my dirty scrubs into the laundry, my mom called me into the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, her expression dead serious. "Sarah, sit down. We need to talk." I took a seat. "What's wrong, Mom?" "I am not going to forbid you from moving forward with your life," she started, her gaze intense. "But I want you to remember something. If you choose a man to spend your life with, You make damn sure he is someone who won't leave you feeling alone inside your own house. Do you understand me? I knew exactly who she was talking about. I nodded. I hear you, Mom. A few weeks later, Arthur asked if my mom and I would accompany him on a drive up to a small town upstate. It was the anniversary of his late wife's passing, and he was going to visit her grave. I hesitated. This was a massive, profoundly intimate line to cross. I talked to my mom about it. She thought about it for a long time, sipping her tea, before finally saying, "If you go simply as a supportive friend. Do not go trying to wear any other label." I made that explicitly clear to Arthur. He agreed immediately. Of course. I am not trying to force you into any role. I'd appreciate the company. The drive was quiet. His hometown was a sleepy, picturesque village. The cemetery sat on a rolling green hill overlooking acres of farmland. Arthur stood in front of the headstone for a very long time, lost in a silent conversation. I stood several yards back, giving him total privacy, just anchoring him with my presence. On the drive back to the city, Arthur looked over at me. "Thank you for coming today. It meant the world to me." "I understand," I replied softly. And I really did. That profound loss was the fire that had forged the grounded, reliable man sitting next to me. After that trip, I realized that there was undeniably a permanent space for him in my heart. Not the desperate, fiery space of a young romance, but a space reserved for someone who could walk into my life without shaking the foundation I had bled to rebuild. One rainy Tuesday evening, Arthur drove me home from the hospital. He put the car in park in my driveway, but he didn't unlock the doors. He turned to me, his face utterly serious. "Sarah, I don't want to live in this gray area anymore. I know you needed time, but I also need to know where this road is going." I looked at him. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Go on. I want to date you officially, with the explicit intention of building something permanent, not to use you as a band-aid, but to build an entirely new life together. If you still aren't ready, I will back off. But I need clarity." I sat in the glow of the dashboard lights for a very long time. I thought of my mom's advice. I thought of my grueling career. I thought of everything I had survived. Then, I looked him in the eye. "I can't make you any massive 10-year promises right this second. But I am willing to give us a real, honest try." Arthur smiled. It wasn't an explosive, triumphant grin, but a deeply warm, relieved smile. That is more than enough. That night, I slept like a rock, no nightmares. No lingering anxieties. I knew I was finally moving forward, not sprinting away from my past, and not desperately clinging to a savior, but walking forward on my own 2 feet, which were finally planted on solid ground. Once Arthur and I officially defined where we stood, our relationship didn't suddenly become loud or performative, but there was an undeniable, subtle shift in the gravity between us. He no longer called just to check the weather. Our conversations had real weight, a genuine exchange of 2 lives merging. I stopped dodging questions about the future, though I still kept a healthy dose of realism. We didn't plaster our relationship all over social media, but we both knew exactly what trajectory we were on. My mother was the first to silently acknowledge it. She never made a big speech, but whenever Arthur was scheduled to come over, she would deliberately cook an extra portion of whatever she was making. She'd casually tell me, "Check the fridge, make a list of what we need for the weekend." These tiny, domestic gestures were the ultimate stamp of approval from a woman who didn't trust easily. Meanwhile, my career was hitting a fever pitch. The surgical research group entered the clinical trial phase, and the pressure on my shoulders doubled. There were nights I didn't unlock my front door until well after midnight, when the house was dead silent and my mom was already fast asleep. I'd slip into her room just to check on her, listening to her steady breathing in the dark, and that alone would refill my tank for the next day. Arthur, entirely aware of my punishing schedule, never demanded date nights I couldn't afford. He would just send a quick text. "Take care of yourself today." Sometimes, reading those 5 words between back-to-back surgeries was the only thing keeping me sane. One Sunday morning, while I was lacing up my sneakers for a run, my mom called out from her bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of her mattress, holding a battered wooden jewelry box. "Sarah, come here for a minute." I sat next to her. She popped the latch and pulled out a simple, scuffed gold band. This was your father's, and my wedding ring. I stared at it, surprised. Why are you giving this to me now? My mom met my gaze, her eyes deep and intensely focused. I'm not giving it to you so you can wear it. I'm giving it to you so you remember what it represents. Your father wasn't a rich man, and he certainly wasn't a smooth talker. But when you were born premature, he spent 7 nights awake in a plastic hospital chair. When I got sick, he dropped every single thing to take care of me. I want you to look at this ring and remember that a marriage is not a party at a country club. A marriage is whether or not the person standing next to you refuses to leave your side when the world goes to hell. A tight knot formed in my throat. I reached out and curled my fingers around the cold gold. I'll remember, Mom. She closed the wooden box with a snap. The choice is yours. I'm just giving you the blueprint. Later that afternoon, I met Arthur at our favorite coffee shop. He immediately noticed I was lost in thought. What's going on in that head of yours? I told him about the ring and my mother's speech. He didn't offer a quick platitude. He just sat back and listened. After a long pause, he asked, "Are you scared?" "Yes, I'm scared," I answered with brutal honesty. "I'm terrified of making the wrong bet again." Arthur looked at me with an unwavering gaze. "Sarah, I'm scared too. But I truly believe that if we spend our whole lives refusing to step onto the ice because we're afraid of falling, we're just going to spend our lives watching from the bleachers." His words didn't feel like a pressure tactic. They felt like a shared truth. It made me think hard. A few days later, Greg materialized out of nowhere, but not to find me. He went looking for my mother. I was pulling into the driveway after a shift when I saw him standing on our porch, looking utterly defeated. My mom was standing inside the screen door. She hadn't invited him in, but she hadn't slammed the door in his face either. "Can I just speak to you for 1 minute?" Greg pleaded. My mom looked at him, her face impassive. "Make it quick." Greg looked down at his shoes. "I'm moving to Ohio permanently. I wanted to say goodbye to you, Miss Irene." My mom gave a single, firm nod. "Wherever you go, act like a decent man. Don't cause another woman the kind of pain you caused here." Greg turned and saw me walking up the driveway. His eyes lacked the desperate, frantic energy they'd had months ago. They were just hollow. "Sarah, I hope you have a good life." I stopped a few feet away and gave him a brief nod. "You too, Greg." There were no tears, no screaming matches, no dramatic closure. Just 2 adults who had once shared a highway but had taken vastly different exits. That evening, I casually mentioned the encounter to Arthur over the phone. He simply replied, "If the book is finally closed, then good." It hit me right then my heart hadn't skipped a single beat when I saw Greg. I felt nothing but a mild apathy. It was the absolute, final proof that the ghost was entirely exorcised. A month later, my research team published preliminary results that sent shockwaves through our surgical specialty. I was selected by the department heads to present the findings at a massive national medical conference. Dr. Miller called me into his office, beaming. "Sarah, this is a career-defining opportunity. Do not mess this up." I was thrilled, but a nagging worry chewed at the back of my mind. My career was demanding more of my blood and sweat than ever before, and I was terrified of neglecting my mom and Arthur. I didn't want to sacrifice my family for a scalpel, but I couldn't step off the gas, either. Arthur was the first one to address the elephant in the room. We were sitting on his back patio while his son played in the yard. "If your job gets even more intense after this conference, is that going to scare you?" I looked down at my hands. "Yes, but it's the life I chose." He reached over and covered my hand with his. "I don't need you to shrink yourself or do less. I just need you to remember to come home." His words washed over me like a cool rain. Not just any man could say that and actually mean it, and very few were secure enough to live by it. One crisp fall weekend, Arthur took my mom and me out to a beautiful rustic seafood restaurant on the waterfront. The breeze coming off the harbor was bracing. The water was completely serene. Halfway through dinner, my mom put her fork down, looked directly at us, and asked, "So, what are the plans here?" I nearly choked on my water. Arthur didn't flinch. He looked at me, smiled, then turned to my mom. "We are building a foundation. We don't want to rush the architecture just yet." My mom gave a satisfied nod. "You don't need to map out the next 50 years. You just need to live tomorrow with decency." When Arthur dropped us off, I lingered by his car window. Are you feeling the interrogation pressure? He laughed out loud. Yeah, but it's the good kind of pressure. I wasn't using Arthur as a shield to block out Greg, and he wasn't using me to fill the agonizing void left by his late wife. We had simply collided at the exact moment we were both finally mature enough to know what a real partnership looked like. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the faint sound of the TV from my mom's room. She was watching old black and white movies the way my dad used to. She had told me once that true happiness isn't usually blindingly bright. Sometimes it's just the quiet luxury of closing your eyes and knowing you are completely safe. I finally understood exactly what she meant. I was slowly wrapping my hands around that exact kind of happiness, without the manic rush, without the fairy tale delusions, but in a way that felt as real and solid as the earth beneath my feet. The months following the conference vanished faster than I could track. The research trial entered its most critical phase, and I was basically living at the hospital. There were evenings when I would stumble out of the surgical wing, strip off my scrubs, and realize it was already pitch black outside. Walking down the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hospital, I would sometimes pause, lean my head against the cool drywall, and take a deep breath. My life wasn't glamorous, and it was certainly exhausting, but it had a profound, undeniable purpose. My mother adapted to my punishing schedule with her usual stoicism. She never complained that I wasn't around to watch TV with her. She just made sure there was always a container of homemade food waiting for me in the fridge. Sometimes I would arrive at 1 a.m., heat up a plate of chicken and rice, and sit alone in the quiet kitchen, feeling a swell of overwhelming affection. Love, I learned, isn't always grand romantic gestures. Sometimes it's just a warm plate of food left on the counter. Arthur navigated my absence with the same quiet grace. He told me one Sunday, over a rare morning coffee together, "You're in the trenches right now. I'm not going to add to your mental load. Just focus." I nodded, entirely too tired to form a coherent sentence, but deeply grateful. That level of understanding confirmed, once again, that I had chosen the right man to let into my life. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, right after I finished a grueling consult, Dr. Miller flagged me down. "Sarah, step into my office." I sat across from his desk. He looked at me with a mix of pride and seriousness. "The hospital board has been watching your trial data. They want to send you down to the Texas Medical Center in Houston for a highly specialized 3-month fellowship. It's a once-in-a-career pipeline to becoming a department head." I froze. 3 months in Texas. 1,000 miles away from my mother, who was getting older. 1,000 miles away from Arthur, right when we were finally finding our rhythm. But it was also the exact opportunity I had been grinding towards since medical school. I found my voice. "Do I have time to think about it?" Dr. Miller nodded. "You have 48 hours. Talk to your family." That night, I sat at the kitchen table and broke the news to my mom. A heavy silence descended on the room. I could see the flash of anxiety in her eyes, not for my career, but the inevitable fear of an aging parent facing an empty house. But then she straightened her posture and said, "You take it, Sarah. Opportunities like this don't wait around. I'll be perfectly fine here." I reached across the table and grabbed her hand. "Mom, I'm terrified of leaving you alone." My mother offered a soft, resilient smile. "I've handled myself alone for decades, kiddo. The only thing you should be terrified of is abandoning your own potential." Her words hit me like a freight train. I knew she was pushing her own fears aside to clear a path for me, exactly the way my father used to do for her. The next day, I met Arthur at a quiet park near his office. We sat on a damp bench as the autumn leaves fell around us. When I told him about the Texas Fellowship, he didn't look shocked, and he didn't look angry. He just asked, "Do you want to go?" "I do." I answered honestly, "But I'm worried." He nodded, staring out at the trees. "It makes sense that you're worried, but if you turn this down because you're afraid of what might happen to us, you will resent me for the rest of your life." I looked at his profile. "Aren't you scared of the distance?" "Hell yes, I'm scared," he said bluntly. "I'm terrified you're going to go down to Texas, become a hotshot surgeon, and realize you don't actually need me." His brutal honesty made me laugh, a sound that broke the tension. "Just the fact that you admit that is enough for me." Arthur turned to look at me, his dark eyes entirely serious. Sarah, I'm not going to chain you down with heavy promises. I'm just going to tell you this. If you go, and you do your thing, and you come back and still want to build a life with me, I will be right here waiting. No strings, no guilt trips. I realized then that this was his way of maintaining his own dignity while offering me absolute freedom. I accepted the fellowship. The weeks leading up to my departure were an absolute blur of packing, briefing the surgical residents, taking over my cases, and organizing my mom's medication schedules into a color-coded binder. Arthur helped me book my flights and shipped a box of my winter gear down to Houston without hovering or making a big production out of it. My mom quietly folded my sweaters into my suitcase, even though I kept telling her I could do it myself. The night before my flight, my mom and I sat on the porch under a pale moon. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and said, "Sarah, remember this. Travel far enough to open your eyes to the world, but never forget the road that leads back home." I rested my head on her shoulder. "I'll remember, Mom." The 3 months in Houston evaporated. The workload at the Texas Medical Center was brutal, but I absorbed surgical techniques I hadn't even known existed. There were nights when I collapsed into my sterile apartment bed, my bones aching. But then I would picture my mom's stoic face, or read a text from Arthur, and I'd find the grit to wake up and do it again. Arthur didn't smother me with FaceTimes. He called every few days with a simple question. "Did you survive the trenches today?" I would give him a quick rundown, and he wouldn't push to keep me on the phone. His reliable, low-maintenance presence was the tether that kept me from floating away. The day I finally flew back home, a cold, steady rain was washing over the city. When the cab pulled up to my house, my mom was standing on the porch. Seeing her, I ran up the steps and threw my arms around her, feeling like I was embracing my entire universe. That evening, Arthur knocked on the door, holding a modest bouquet of flowers. He looked at me, taking in my exhausted face, and smiled. "Beat?" "Exhausted," I laughed. "But it was totally worth it." He nodded. "That's all that matters." We sat in the living room and talked for hours. We didn't need to dissect every single day of the last 3 months. Just looking into his eyes, I knew that distance means absolutely nothing when someone has already built a permanent home in your chest. Later that night, as Arthur was getting ready to leave, my mom looked at the two of us and said casually, "If you two have thought this all the way through, there's no point in dragging your feet anymore." I whipped my head around to look at Arthur. He met my gaze with an expression that was incredibly calm, but loaded with absolute certainty. I knew right then that our story had finally reached the point where it demanded an ending, not a rushed, chaotic one, but one built on undeniable respect. A week later, Arthur came over to the house on a Saturday morning. I knew today was different, not because he was wearing a nicer jacket, or because he brought coffee, but because of the look in his eye. It was the look of a man who had analyzed the data, weighed all the variables, and had definitively decided to plant his flag in the ground without a shadow of a doubt. My mom opened the door, took one look at him, and then glanced at me. She didn't say a word. She just took a step back toward the kitchen. I understood that there are moments when adults don't need to narrate the scene, they just need to yield the floor. Arthur stood in front of me. His voice was deep, and it didn't shake. "Sarah, I've thought about this from every angle. I don't want to stretch this out anymore, and I don't want to leave you guessing. I want to formally ask you, and your mother, for permission to marry you. To do it the right way." I didn't burst into dramatic tears, and I didn't feel the suffocating panic I had felt a year ago. I just felt my heart slow down, as if it had finally locked into its proper rhythm. I looked past him to my mom in the kitchen doorway. She held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, solid nod. "It's your call, Sarah." I looked back at Arthur. "I don't need a massive country club reception. I don't need a string quartet or a show for the neighbors. I just need a peaceful home where no one will ever leave me stranded at the door." Arthur nodded, his jaw set. "You have my word, forever." Our wedding took place a few months later. It was so incredibly understated that some of the hospital staff were genuinely shocked. There was no grand hotel ballroom, no blaring DJ. We rented out a warm, intimate, rustic restaurant. There were only a handful of tables, filled strictly with our chosen family and truest friends. I wore a simple, elegant ivory dress. My mother sat in the front row, squeezing my hand with a grip of iron. I looked around the room and didn't see a single face that had ever wished me harm. I felt no sadness, no lingering trauma, just an overwhelming sense of lightness. Arthur stood opposite me. He didn't recite a poem or offer overly flowery, unrealistic vows. He looked me in the eye and said, "I'm not great at making 50-year promises, but I promise you this. Every single day, I will choose to come home to you." I understood the absolute gravity of that sentence. For a man who had lost his first wife to a tragedy, the concept of coming home wasn't a mundane routine. It was a deliberate, courageous choice. After the wedding, I didn't take a luxurious month-long honeymoon or a leave of absence. I went right back to the surgical wing. Because that was the life I was built for. Arthur never complained, and he never threw it in my face. He got used to me walking through the door at 9 p.m. He got used to the microwave beeping as I reheated leftovers for the second time. Sometimes I'd be so utterly wiped out that I'd just sit in a dining chair staring blankly at the wall. Without asking, Arthur would place a glass of ice water in front of me and rest his heavy hand on my shoulder. Eventually, my mother moved into our house. It was a spacious place, with plenty of room for the three of us and Arthur's son. She kept up her routine of waking up at dawn to water the garden and start prepping dinner. Arthur started calling her mom with a casual ease that melted my heart. Once, I overheard my mom talking on the phone to one of her old neighborhood friends. "He doesn't talk my ear off," she said about Arthur, "but he pays attention. And that's all a mother can ask for." I knew that was the equivalent of a Pulitzer Prize from Irene. My career continued its upward trajectory. The clinical trial was a massive success, and I was given more administrative responsibilities at the hospital. Occasionally, the old panic would flare up the fear that my ambition was going to devour my marriage. But whenever I voiced those anxieties, Arthur would just shake his head and say, "You hold down the OR, Sarah. I'll hold down the fort." His words weren't meant to make me complacent. They were meant to give me permission to fly. I no longer had to tear myself in half choosing between the scalpel and the stove, because the man standing next to me didn't demand I sacrifice pieces of myself to stroke his ego. One rainy Sunday, while I was organizing some boxes in the closet, I found the small wooden jewelry box holding my parents' wedding rings. I held my dad's gold band in my palm for a long time. I finally fully grasped what my mother had meant. A marriage isn't the split second you slide a ring onto a finger. It's the thousands of quiet, exhausted Tuesday nights where two people sit in a room together and realize they don't feel empty anymore. Every now and then, rumors about Greg's family drifted my way. He had stayed out in Ohio, practically cutting off contact with his relatives. Agnes's health had continued to decline. Her days spent in a bitter, lonely house. I didn't actively avoid hearing about them, but I certainly didn't seek the information out. I genuinely just hoped that they had learned their lesson. The space in my chest that used to hold resentment was completely boarded up. One winter night, during a brutal on-call shift, a massive multi-car pileup flooded the ER. I sprinted into the OR on pure adrenaline. 4 grueling hours later, we managed to stabilize the final patient. When I pushed through the double doors into the waiting area, peeling off my scrub cap, I saw Arthur leaning against the wall, holding my heavy winter coat over his arm. He looked up. He didn't ask if the surgery was a success, and he didn't ask if I was going to make the front page of the hospital newsletter. He just looked at my tired eyes and asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded. He draped the heavy coat over my shoulders and said softly, "Let's go home." In that exact moment, a flashback hit me. I remembered that horrific morning standing outside the country club. Years ago, I had also walked out of a life-saving surgery, the sweat still drying on my forehead, only to be met with a firing squad of disgusted stares and a locked door. Now, I was walking out of an OR, but there was someone waiting for me. Not because I was a hero, not because of my salary, but simply because I was his wife. I realized then that karma isn't necessarily some dramatic, vengeful force. Karma is just the universe slowly guiding everyone to the exact place they belong. A year later, on the exact calendar date I was supposed to have married Greg, Arthur took my mom and me out to a nice steakhouse. Nobody brought up the past. My mom was laughing more. Her health was incredibly stable. As we were clinking our wine glasses, Arthur raised an eyebrow with a smirk. "This exact day a few years ago, you were probably having a really bad time." I smiled, taking a sip of my Cabernet. Because of that really bad time, I get to sit at this table tonight. Later that evening, I stood alone on the back deck of our house, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the faint city lights on the horizon. I thought about the jagged, painful road I had walked, and the deep wounds that had once made me question my own worth. If, on that fateful morning, I had chosen to ignore my pager and walk past the ER, if I had bowed my head, begged for Agnes's forgiveness, and married Greg out of a sheer terror of ending up alone, I probably would have lived a very quiet, socially acceptable life. But it would have been completely hollow on the inside. Standing there in the cold air, I wasn't infinitely richer, and I wasn't a household name, but I was fiercely, unapologetically true to myself. I was a trauma surgeon. I was Irene's daughter. I was Arthur's wife. And above all, I was Sarah, a woman who refused to trade her conscience for a seat at someone else's table. Arthur stepped out onto the deck, sliding the glass door shut behind him. He stepped up beside me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "What are you thinking about out here?" "The ending," I said quietly. He looked down at me, confused. "The ending of what?" I smiled, leaning back against his chest. "The ending of a very old, very exhausting story." "And?" he asked, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "And the beginning of ours." He took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, and didn't say another word. There are some endings in life that don't require a standing ovation or a dramatic monologue. Sometimes, the perfect ending is just a quiet house with the porch light left on, someone waiting for you by the door, and the absolute, unshakable peace of knowing you never have to run away again,